What would you do if your life's final moments were spent fighting for your dignity against someone who saw you as less than human? 3 days before her wedding, Nia Holloway, a brilliant, compassionate black attorney, walked into a restaurant to grab a quick lunch. She wasn't looking for trouble. She wasn't making a scene. She was just hungry and exhausted after a long day of wedding preparations. Would you tip someone who disrespected you? What if they treated you like you didn't even deserve to be there? Nia made her choice. She stood her ground and refused to pay for disrespect. Her courage cost her everything. What kind of world do we live in where a $5 tip becomes a death sentence? Where someone can harbor so much hatred that a minor act of defiance turns into murder? As Nia lay bleeding on the restaurant floor, customers screamed, some rushed to help, and others stood frozen in horror. But the man who stabbed her, despite a known history of violence against black women, stood there, unbothered. What happened inside that restaurant wasn't random, and by the time the door closed behind her, it was already too late. But the real question is, could this have been stopped before it ever began? Welcome to True Crime Story HQ. I thank you, my viewers, most especially my subscribers, for your support as we keep improving and bringing daily told and untold true crime stories update. Please don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Nia Holloway was the kind of person whose presence left an imprint long after she walked away. Brilliant, determined, and compassionate, she had built a life rooted in justice. Her passion wasn't just about winning cases. It was about standing up for those silenced by prejudice and fear. She grew up in Chicago, in a close-knit family that nurtured her dreams from the start. Her parents, Evelyn and Charles Holloway, taught her that strength and kindness could coexist. She carried those lessons through every challenge, whether it was excelling at the top of her class in law school or fighting for justice in cases involving workplace discrimination. It was during her second year of law school that she met Jordan Myers. Their connection was immediate, a partnership built on shared values, long conversations, and quiet moments of understanding. Jordan admired Nia's drive, and Nia loved how he made her feel grounded, no matter how turbulent her workload became. They weren't just in love, they were a team. And after years of hard work, sacrifices, and milestones, they were just days away from their wedding. Nia had always dreamed of a ceremony filled with meaning, something more than decorations and vows. She wanted their day to honor the generations that shaped their stories. Her excitement was infectious as she talked about everything from her dress to the song she'd walked down the aisle to. But those dreams were destined to remain unfulfilled. Then there was Eric Donovan, a name that would become infamous, a man whose life had unraveled long before he crossed paths with Nia. Eric was known to some as a quiet, unremarkable waiter, but beneath that surface lay a long, troubled history. His childhood was marked by instability and loneliness. Mental health issues began to surface early, leading to multiple stays in psychiatric institutions. Yet each time he was released, he seemed to slip through the cracks, his struggles dismissed as something for someone else to manage. But what truly set him apart, what made his path so dangerous, was his seething disdain for certain customers, particularly black women. These weren't passing thoughts. They were deep-rooted resentments that simmered within him. There were warnings, signs that something was wrong, incidents that could have served as alarms. Yet each time, they went ignored or excused. Eric's interactions weren't shaped by professionalism, but by a toxic sense of entitlement and bitterness. His resentment festered, fed by a belief that he could lash out and escape the consequences. These two people, Nia and Eric, were never supposed to cross paths. Their lives were shaped by such different stories, and yet, on a busy afternoon, their worlds collided in a way that would change everything. The morning sun filtered through the blinds as Nia Holloway's phone buzzed on her nightstand. She was already awake, her mind buzzing with a mental checklist of everything that needed to be done. It was 3 days until the wedding, a day she had planned for so meticulously that even the smallest details felt monumental. She had made sure every choice reflected her and Jordan's story, the colours, the music, the venue. Today was supposed to be her last major push before everything could fall into place. She brushed her hair back, smiled at her reflection, and whispered, "Almost there." After slipping on a pair of comfortable shoes, she grabbed her purse and headed out the door, ready to tackle the day. Her first stop was the florist. The smell of fresh blooms greeted her as she walked in. Rows of roses, lilies, and hydrangeas stretched before her. She paused for a moment, taking it all in. "These will look perfect by the altar," she thought, as she confirmed the final arrangement with the florist, ticking another item off her list. Next was the bridal boutique, where her bridesmaids were waiting for a final fitting. There were joyful laughs and playful banter as they twirled in their dresses, imagining the grand celebration ahead. Nia's face lit up as she watched her friends spin and pose in front of the mirror. This wasn't just a wedding for her, it was a celebration of love, family, and the life she and Jordan had built together. Hours passed in a blur of appointments and errands, picking up the custom table centerpieces, approving the seating arrangements, even dropping by the bakery for one last taste test of the cake. By midday, she felt the familiar tug of hunger gnawing at her. Her stomach rumbled, a reminder that she'd been so focused on checking off her list that she hadn't eaten. She smiled to herself, thinking about the quick lunch she'd grab before diving back into wedding prep. It was supposed to be a small, simple stop, a brief moment to refuel in an otherwise hectic day. But not for Eric Donovan. Miles away from Nia's excitement and anticipation, Eric's day began much darker. His alarm blared, but instead of jolting him awake, it only added to his growing irritation. He stared at the ceiling, his jaw tight. Another shift at the restaurant, a job he had grown to resent. In his mind, he deserved better. Life had cheated him, or at least that's what he told himself every morning. He moved sluggishly through his apartment, his frustration palpable in the way he slammed cabinet doors and tossed aside clothes. A wrinkled uniform hung over the chair, a visual reminder of everything he despised. As he buttoned his shirt, he muttered under his breath about his manager, his co-workers, and the customers he was forced to serve. By the time he left his apartment, he was already carrying the weight of 1,000 grievances. The world outside felt suffocating. The cheerful sunlight only seemed to mock him. As he trudged toward the restaurant, Eric's bitterness sharpened with every step. Once he arrived, his co-workers greeted him with polite nods, but they quickly returned to their tasks, careful not to engage too much. They'd seen this side of him before, quiet, distant, but volatile beneath the surface. Some even joked that Eric was just having one of those days. But the truth was, Eric's bad days had become the norm, and everyone had learned to avoid stepping on whatever invisible line might set him off. At the service counter, Eric prepped for the lunch shift with a mechanical, detached focus. The clatter of dishes, the hum of orders being called out, it was all just noise to him now. He tightened his apron and glanced at the tables he'd be serving. Each face he saw felt like a reminder of everything he thought the world had taken from him. There was a moment when a fellow waiter, Lisa, noticed how tense he was. She asked, "You good?" A casual check-in she'd done dozens of times before. Eric gave a tight, forced nod, but said nothing. Lisa hesitated, sensing that his silence felt different today, but the lunch rush was starting, and she didn't have time to dig deeper. In hindsight, she would replay that moment over and over, wishing she had said more, done more. But at that time, Eric was just another disgruntled co-worker in a sea of customers and chaos. The shift wore on, and Eric's thoughts spiraled. The slightest gestures, someone raising their hand to get his attention, another customer pointing at an empty glass, all felt like personal slights. His frustration simmered beneath the surface, building with each passing moment. And then Nia walked in. He noticed her the moment she stepped inside. His gaze locked onto her as she moved with the confidence of someone who was used to being treated with respect. But in Eric's warped perspective, that confidence wasn't something to admire. It was something to resent. As she settled at her table, unaware of the dark cloud looming nearby, Eric's resentment found its next target. Two lives, shaped by vastly different circumstances, had converged in that restaurant. Nia, filled with hope and anticipation for her future. Eric, weighed down by bitterness and anger he could no longer contain. The stage was set, and in a matter of minutes, an ordinary afternoon would become anything but. Nia stepped into the restaurant with a soft exhale, grateful for a moment to rest after a whirlwind of errands. The familiar hum of conversations and the aroma of comfort food surrounded her. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small, local spot where she could grab something quick, recharge, and get back to her list. Her heels clicked softly against the tiled floor as she moved toward a corner table near the window. She chose it for the sunlight streaming in, hoping it might offer a brief sense of peace amid the chaos of the day. She settled into her chair, placing her purse beside her and smoothing the edges of the menu. For a moment, she let herself relax, her mind still playing through the rest of the day's plans. She wasn't thinking about anything unusual, just the little details left to wrap up. Across the room, Eric Donovan noticed her immediately. He watched her with an intensity that felt unsettling, though Nia hadn't noticed it yet. To him, she stood out, not because of what she was wearing or what she ordered, but because she was confident, composed, and carried herself in a way that ignited something bitter inside him. Eric approached the table slowly, his footsteps heavier than they needed to be. Nia glanced up, offering a polite smile, but the look in his eyes wasn't one of welcome. There was no friendliness, no professional courtesy, just an icy indifference that hung in the air between them. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice flat with a hint of condescension that caught Nia off guard. She blinked, momentarily thrown by his tone, but kept her composure. She was used to handling tense situations in courtrooms, after all. This was nothing in comparison. "I'll have the grilled chicken sandwich and iced tea, please," she said, her voice calm and measured. Eric jotted the order with a barely concealed scowl and walked away without another word. Nia watched him leave, feeling a strange tension settle over the table, but willing herself to brush it off. She was here to eat, not to dwell on someone else's bad attitude. The minutes dragged as she waited for her food. The noise of the restaurant, conversations, silverware clinking, the occasional laughter, faded into the background. She scrolled through her phone, checking messages from friends and family, excited for the upcoming wedding. Then Eric returned. The plate hit the table with a dull thud. Nia looked up, startled by the force he used to set it down. Her iced tea sloshed slightly in its glass. Eric didn't apologize. He just stood there for a moment, staring at her with an expression that was almost daring her to react. Nia felt the simmer of frustration in her chest, but swallowed it. She was a customer, her day was already hectic, and she did not want to allow her emotions to get to her. She remained calmed. She wasn't about to let a stranger ruin her afternoon. She reached for her fork and began to eat, determined to focus on the meal instead of the man's hostility. But Eric didn't move. He stood there just long enough for it to feel uncomfortable. When he finally turned and walked away, Naya let out a slow breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She focused on each bite, trying to enjoy her sandwich despite the strange tension that lingered. Across the room, Eric continued to glance at her, his jaw tight, his knuckles pale as he gripped the edge of the service counter. To everyone else, it looked like another busy lunch hour. But for Naya and Eric, something unspoken had begun, a collision of emotions she didn't deserve and rage he couldn't control. Nia finished her meal, placed her napkin on the table, and reached for her wallet. She was ready to leave, unaware of just how much danger was standing only a few feet away. Nia wiped the corner of her mouth with the napkin, folded it neatly, and placed it beside her plate. Despite the unsettling tension that hovered over her meal, she was ready to move on. She reached for the bill, expecting something simple, a standard check for her modest meal. But as she unfolded the slip of paper, her eyes froze on the numbers. $20. Her brows furrowed slightly as she scanned the details. She had ordered a grilled chicken sandwich and an iced tea, both items clearly marked as some of the more affordable choices on the menu. Yet the total seemed unreasonably high. And there it was, at the bottom of the receipt, a mandatory 25% tip. Her chest tightened, not from the money itself, but from the principle of it all. She felt the injustice settle into her bones. The memory of Eric's behavior, the cold tone, the hostile glances, the way he practically threw the plate at her like she wasn't worthy of basic respect. And now, after all that, he expected her to reward him with an additional 25% of her hard-earned money. For a moment, Nia simply stared at the bill, letting the absurdity of the situation sink in. A quiet internal debate began to stir within her. Do I just pay it and leave? Do I let this go because it's easier than creating a scene? She wondered. But another voice in her head, the one she'd nurtured throughout her life, the one that fought for justice when others stayed silent, pushed back. No, it said firmly. Respect isn't optional. It's not something I'm going to pay for, especially when it hasn't been given. She could hear her late grandmother's words echo in her mind. If you let people trample on your dignity once, they'll never stop. Her decision was made. Nia reached into her purse, calmly pulled out a $20 bill, and placed it neatly on the table, right beside the receipt. The cash was exact, down to the last cent. But no more. There was no room in this moment for a reward Eric hadn't earned. But this time, Nia didn't simply walk away in silence. She glanced toward Eric, who was still watching her from the service counter, and her voice was steady as she spoke. I won't give you a dime of my money. Eric's eyes widened slightly, his face flushing red. She added with unwavering resolve, Go pick it up from someone you respect. The words hung in the air for a moment, sharp and unshakable. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise of the restaurant like a blade. Nia had chosen to stand her ground in the most dignified way possible, refusing to be disrespected any longer. She tucked her wallet back into her purse, pushed her chair out, and stood. She didn't rush, didn't falter. With quiet, measured grace, she adjusted the strap of her purse and began walking toward the exit. Eric watched everything. He had been lingering near the counter, pretending to check something, but his eyes never left her table. As soon as he saw her place the $20 bill down and nothing more, and after hearing her parting words, something in him twisted into a tight, unbreakable knot. His breathing quickened. The edges of his vision blurred as frustration surged through him like a wave crashing against a brittle dam. She didn't tip me, his mind repeated, over and over again, louder with each pass. She just walked away like she's better than me." Eric's sense of control had always been fragile at best, built on a foundation of bitterness and blame. In this moment, it cracked entirely. If you are in the same situation and got disrespected, will you pay the tips? Comment what you would have done in similar position. Nia continued toward the door, unaware of the growing storm behind her. To her, it was over. She had made her statement and chosen her dignity over convenience. But for Eric, this was only the beginning. He stepped forward, fists clenched at his sides. The room around him, the other diners, the laughter, the soft music, all faded into nothingness. In his mind, there was only her and the perceived slight that he couldn't let go of. And as Nia reached for the door handle, Eric took one deliberate step in her direction, driven by a rage that had finally found a target. The air inside the restaurant was still ordinary. Conversations continued, silverware clinked, servers moved between tables. But for Eric Donovan, nothing would ever feel ordinary again. Nia's hand was just inches from the door handle when she felt a sudden presence close behind her. Eric had moved silently, his footsteps blending into the ambient noise of the restaurant. He wasn't thinking, at least not in a way most people would understand. His mind was a tangled storm of fury and fractured pride. And in that moment, something inside him snapped completely. Before anyone could react, Eric's hand shot forward. The cold glint of steel flashed under the harsh lights as he pulled out a knife from beneath his apron. The blade arced downward in a swift, brutal motion, striking Nia in her side. The first stab stole her breath, a searing pain that spread like fire across her body. She gasped, a sound of shock and agony mixed into one as her eyes widened in disbelief. Her hand clutched instinctively at the wound, but before she could process what had happened, Eric's hand moved again. The second stab struck deeper. Nia's knees buckled beneath her. Her purse slipped from her shoulder, landing with a soft thud on the floor as her legs gave way. She collapsed near the entrance, her body crumpling against the cold tiles. For a second, the restaurant was silent, frozen in collective horror. Time seemed to stop as the reality of what had just happened settled into the minds of the stunned diners. Then the silence shattered. A woman at a nearby table let out a scream, a raw, primal sound that seemed to snap everyone out of their stupor. Chairs scraped back as people stood, their eyes darting between Nia's unmoving form and Eric, who still stood there, the knife in his hand dripping red. Two men rushed forward, knocking Eric back before he could strike again. The knife clattered to the ground as they pinned him against the wall. A server knelt beside her, pressing napkins against the wound in a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding. Blood soaked through the thin fabric almost immediately. Nia's skin had gone pale, her breaths shallow and laboured. Her eyes flickered as if trying to focus, but the pain was too much. "Call 911!" someone else yelled, their voice cracking with panic. Phones were pulled out as multiple patrons called for emergency assistance. Voices overlapped, descriptions of the attack, the location, pleas for paramedics to hurry. The restaurant had descended into chaos, people crying, shouting, some rushing outside to escape the scene, others rooted in place, helplessly watching as life drained from the woman they had seen laughing and vibrant only moments before. The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder with each second. The paramedics burst through the doors with urgency, their equipment rattling as they dropped beside Nia. "We've got her," one of them said as they worked quickly, checking her vitals, cutting away fabric to access the wounds. But Nia's pulse was faint, barely a whisper beneath their fingers. The blood loss was catastrophic. The stretcher was lifted with precision as they began carrying her toward the ambulance, her body strapped down, oxygen flowing through a mask over her nose and mouth. But with every step they took, Nia's breaths became weaker. She didn't cry out. There was no sound, just the quiet slowing of her chest rising and falling. And as the ambulance doors slammed shut behind her, her body gave one final, trembling exhale. Nia Holloway was gone. The hospital's sterile halls felt like a different world as Nia's family arrived, summoned by the devastating call. Jordan Myers, her fiancé, burst through the doors first. His heart was pounding as though trying to tear itself apart inside his chest. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice trembling with fear. The look on the nurse's face was enough to stop him in his tracks. Jordan's knees buckled. He clung to the counter for support, tears already streaming down his face. The world blurred around him. It wasn't supposed to end this way. They had made plans, built a future. Nia's parents arrived next. Evelyn Holloway let out a heart-wrenching cry as soon as she saw Jordan's face. She collapsed into her husband Charles's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Charles tried to stay strong, but even he couldn't hold back the tears that welled up in his eyes. Friends began arriving as the news spread, their faces painted with disbelief and sorrow. The waiting room filled with quiet sobs and whispered prayers as those closest to Nia grappled with the unthinkable loss. In a single moment, their world had shattered. Jordan sat in silence, staring at the floor, replaying every memory he had of Nia. The way her laugh could brighten the darkest day. The way she always touched his shoulder when she passed by him in the kitchen. Her dreams for their wedding. Now, there would be no vows exchanged, no first dance, no happily ever after. Nia's mother whispered over and over, "Why? Why her?" No one had an answer. There was only a gaping void, a life full of promise, stolen in a senseless act of violence. And as the sun set outside the hospital, the world moved on as though nothing had changed. But for the Holloway family, everything had changed forever. The police arrived at the scene within minutes, the flashing red and blue lights bathing the restaurant in a harsh glow. Officers entered swiftly, ordering the crowd to step back. The chaos of shouts and cries began to subside as Eric Donovan was pulled away from the wall where two patrons had pinned him. Eric's face was devoid of any emotion as they cuffed his wrists behind his back. He didn't struggle. He didn't shout. He stood unnervingly still, his eyes staring straight ahead as though he were disconnected from the scene entirely. "You're under arrest for assault and murder," an officer stated firmly. But Eric's silence persisted. There was no plea of innocence, no panic, just a cold, unsettling quiet. Back at the station, detectives began piecing together the events leading up to Nia Holloway's tragic death. Witnesses were interviewed one by one, each recounting the horrifying scene, the unprovoked attack, Nia's strength in her final moments, and Eric's chilling demeanor. But as the investigation deepened, the focus began to shift toward a far more disturbing truth. The history that Eric Donovan carried long before he walked into that restaurant. In the weeks that followed, police records, psychiatric files, and employment reports painted a grim picture. Eric's violent tendencies had been documented for years. He had been admitted to psychiatric institutions multiple times following incidents of aggression, specifically targeting black women. Each time, he was released after a brief evaluation and deemed fit to re-enter society. One report described how he had attacked a black woman outside a grocery store, accusing her of thinking she was better than him, simply because she didn't acknowledge his presence. Another detailed an altercation with a co-worker whom he verbally harassed for days before he was finally dismissed from the job. Yet somehow, despite the mounting evidence of his instability, Eric continued to slip through the cracks of a system that was supposed to protect the public. The restaurant where he worked had conducted only a minimal background check, one that failed to reveal the extent of his violent past. Why will someone with his record been hired to work in customer service? Debates ignited over the importance of workplace screenings and mental health accountability. Protesters gathered outside the restaurant, demanding answers and reform. Signs reading "Justice for Nia" and "Protect Black Women" were held high as chants filled the air. Months later, Eric Donovan's trial began. The courtroom was filled with family and friends of Nia's family. The tension was palpable as Eric was led into the room, his expression as blank as it had been the day he was arrested. The prosecution laid out the events of that fateful day in painstaking detail. Surveillance footage from the restaurant was shown to the jury, grainy but clear enough to capture the attack. The footage showed Nia standing near the door, adjusting her purse, and then Eric's sudden, violent lunge. Gasps filled the courtroom as the video ended, freezing on the moment Eric was restrained by two men as Nia lay motionless on the floor. Witnesses from the restaurant were called to testify. Lisa, a waitress who had worked alongside Eric, took the stand first. Her voice trembled as she described the moments leading up to the attack. The way Eric had been unusually tense that morning, the way he watched Nia with a strange intensity. "I knew something was off," she said, wiping tears from her eyes. "But I didn't think it would end like this." Other patrons described the terror they felt and the desperate attempts to save Nia as she bled out on the floor. Their accounts painted a harrowing picture of a woman who had simply stopped for lunch and ended up fighting for her life. Her fiancé, Jordan Myers, was called to the stand. He struggled to speak at first, his grief weighing heavily on every word. "She was the love of my life," he said quietly, his eyes red-rimmed. "We were 3 days away from starting our forever." He recounted the plans they had made, the life they had built together, and the devastation of knowing that those dreams had been stolen from them in an instant. Nia's mother, Evelyn Holloway, gave one of the most heart-wrenching testimonies of the trial. "My daughter wasn't just a name in the news," she said, her voice steady despite the pain beneath it. "She was a fighter, a sister, a woman with dreams. She deserved to grow old, to have children of her own, to live." The defense attempted to argue that Eric's actions were the result of untreated mental illness, pointing to his multiple institutionalizations. He was a psycho. But this argument unraveled when the prosecution revealed damning reports, records showing that Eric had a clear history of targeting black women, fueled not by uncontrolled impulses alone, but by a deep-seated hatred. The most shocking revelation came when the court learned that Eric had been involved in other violent altercations before. In each instance, the victims were black women, and each time the incidents were brushed aside as minor or misunderstandings. The jury listened intently as the prosecutor laid out the pattern. Eric's aggression was not random. It was deliberate, calculated, and ignored for far too long. The deliberations lasted less than a day. When the jury returned to the courtroom, the air was thick with anticipation. "We find the defendant, Eric Donovan, guilty of first-degree murder," the foreman announced. A ripple of emotion swept through the room. Nia's family wept openly, clutching one another as the weight of justice settled in. Eric remained expressionless as the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered once more, not in protest, but in solidarity. They held candles and signs, their voices soft with sorrow but unwavering in their call for change. Nia Holloway's story had come to an end, but her legacy lived on in every voice that demanded justice, every policy reconsidered, and every life touched by her strength and resilience. In the end, this trial was not just about a crime. It was about a system that failed to protect her and countless others like her. And though justice had been served, it was not enough to bring her back. It was, however, a reminder that silence and complacency have a cost no one should ever have to pay. In the months that followed, they became fierce advocates for change. They pushed for stricter background checks, more rigorous oversight of hiring practices, and anti-discrimination measures to ensure no one else would face what Nia had endured. Their journey was not without pain. There were sleepless nights, moments of doubt, and the unrelenting ache of loss. Yet their love for Nia fueled their mission. But the lingering question remained. How do we prevent tragedies like this from happening again? Could stronger accountability have saved Nia's life? How many other lives hang in the balance, waiting for systems meant to protect them to step up? Nia Holloway's story is a reminder of how fragile life can be and how easily lives can be lost when warning signs are ignored. She was a brilliant lawyer, a beloved daughter, and a fiancée on the brink of a new chapter. Her legacy endures not only in memory, but in every voice that rises to demand justice. So, we ask you to remember Nia. Support efforts for workplace safety, background checks, and anti-discrimination policies.